The uncle who abused me as a child passed away, but his final act of cruelty came from beyond the grave. He left me his $250,000 in student loans to pay off. When I refused, the justice system threatened me with prison time, callously stating that the law is the law. Left with no choice, I decided to fight back. My uncle, the one who did terrible things to me, died with $250,000 in student loan debt, and that debt was passed on to me to settle. The justice system was no help, basically saying the law is the law, and if I didn't pay up, I would lose my freedom. So I fought back. An old man, probably in his 70s, who I had never met before, appeared at my front door, and when he explained why he was there, I seriously contemplated ending his life right on my porch. You see, when I was just a little kid, I had this uncle named Andrew who had, to put it mildly, some very disturbing preferences. I was only 7 years old when he cornered me in my bedroom closet and did whatever he pleased. My parents were home at the time, but they were too absorbed in an argument downstairs to realize their own child was being assaulted just 20 feet away. I remember it was painful to sit down for days afterward, and when I tried to tell my parents about it, they didn't just disbelieve me. They yelled at me for making up such horrible lies. In fact, they invited Andrew over again that very same weekend, just so I could apologize to him. I could still feel myself trembling at the dinner table, a 7-year-old boy surrounded by 3 intimidating adults all staring down at me. I ended up telling Andrew I was sorry, and my parents even chimed in to apologize to him on my behalf. Well, as you can probably guess, Andrew did it again during that same visit, in the very same closet. We were gone for maybe 5 minutes, and yet somehow, my parents never connected the dots. Funnily enough, it was my teacher who first noticed something was wrong. She asked me why I wasn't sitting in my chair, and I just completely broke down. I asked if I could whisper it to her, and I saw her face just drop. She took me out into the hallway, knelt down, and I just started sobbing. I told her everything about Andrew, about how my parents wouldn't believe me, and I remember pleading with her to please believe me. She called the police right then and there, and before I really understood what was happening, I was being taken in for questioning. A police officer asked me to use action figures to show what had happened, but beyond that, my memory is fuzzy. All I know is that I stayed with some strangers for a while until the trial date arrived. And even though my parents weren't on the stand, they might as well have been because their faces were all over the news and our entire town knew what they'd done. The whole case was overwhelming for a 7-year-old. They may have been monsters, but they were still my family. I can still remember how it felt to get up on that stand and describe, in detail, what he did to me. I remember my father mouthing, "Shut up," at me every time I opened my mouth, and how he mouthed, "Don't bother coming home," as soon as the sentence was read. My uncle got 19 years, an especially severe sentence because he had a prior conviction for something similar. Watching him get led away was hard, and watching my parents walk out of the courtroom without even looking at me was even harder. Fast forward 21 years. I'm 28 now, and I had managed to get over all the messed up trauma from my childhood, or at least I thought I had, until some old man knocked on my door. I opened it, and he was standing there in a suit, holding a briefcase. I told him he probably had the wrong address, but he insisted he didn't. "Are you the nephew of Andrew? Last name?" My world just stopped. I slowly nodded, and that's when he delivered the news. News that made me fully grasp how broken our legal system really is. He informed me that my uncle had passed away. My first instinct was to say I didn't care, but he cut me off and kept talking. Apparently, I was my uncle's closest living relative, and my uncle had a significant amount of college debt left, $250,000 to be exact. And because college loans are one of the only types of debt you can't discharge through bankruptcy, they can be passed down even after death. And that's exactly what happened to me. Thanks to our wonderful legal system, I was now responsible for paying off $250,000 in college loans for the man who repeatedly molested me as a child and ruined my life. I just stared at the man in the suit and told him bluntly that I would not be paying. I told him what my uncle did, thinking that would change his mind, but he didn't even blink. He said he flat out didn't care. He said my uncle could have murdered my firstborn for all he cared. I still had to pay the money, and if I didn't, I'd face 10 years in prison. I just stared at the old man, my entire body turning cold. 10 years in prison for something I never agreed to, for the man who destroyed my childhood. I felt my hands begin to shake, and I clenched them into tight fists. The debt collector remained unfazed, just standing there in his fancy suit, probably waiting for me to have a breakdown. I told him to get the hell off my property before I called the police. He actually laughed at me, laughed right in my face, and said the cops wouldn't do a thing. He pushed his business card into my hand and informed me that I had 30 days to start making payments before they initiated legal action. I slammed the door so hard that the windows in my apartment rattled. I spent the next hour pacing my apartment, kicking furniture, and punching the walls until my knuckles were raw and bloody. I couldn't wrap my head around it. $250,000 for that monster's education. I grabbed my phone and called the only person I could think of, my friend Marcus from work. He picked up on the third ring, and I just spilled everything. He was as stunned as I was, just kept repeating, "That can't be legal." He urged me to talk to a lawyer immediately, so I hung up and started searching online. I found a local lawyer named Richard Simmons who specialized in debt law and managed to schedule an appointment for the next day. I barely slept that night, just tossing and turning, haunted by nightmares of Andrew, prison cells, and mountains of debt. I showed up at the lawyer's office looking like I hadn't slept in a week. Richard was an older man with gray hair and thick glasses. I laid out my situation, showing him the paperwork the debt collector had left. Richard frowned as he looked it over. Then he gave me the bad news. In our state, certain debts can indeed transfer to the next of kin. He said he'd never seen it with student loans, but the paperwork looked legitimate. I felt the ground disappear beneath me. Richard said he would do some research and get back to me, but he warned me it would cost money I simply didn't have. I left his office feeling even more hopeless than before. I tried calling my Aunt Cheryl, my dad's sister, hoping she might help or at least offer some advice. That was a huge mistake. The second I mentioned Andrew's name, she became cold and distant. She said I should have never made up those stories about him as a kid, that I was the one who tore the family apart with my lies. I hung up on her mid-sentence, my hand shaking so badly I nearly dropped my phone. Next, I called my cousin Peter, but he was no better. He suggested that maybe this was karma for what I did to Andrew, getting him sent to prison all those years ago. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. These people were still defending that monster. I felt completely and utterly alone. I spent the next few days and days going to work and coming home, but not really present. Richard, the lawyer, called me back on the third day with more bad news. He confirmed the debt was legitimate and said I had two options: try to fight it in court, which would cost thousands in legal fees I couldn't afford, or set up a payment plan. I hung up and threw my phone across the room. I decided to try contacting the college where Andrew got his degree. Maybe they could help. I found a number for the financial aid office at Westfield University. The woman who answered sounded completely bored. I explained my situation, trying to keep my voice steady. She put me on hold for 20 minutes, then came back and said there was nothing they could do. The loans were through a private company, not the school. She transferred me to another department, who transferred me again, and I ended up with an administrator named Gregory. He was about as useful as a screen door on a submarine, just repeating that the university had no authority over private loans. I asked if they could at least provide documents about the loans when they were taken out, what they were for, and he said I'd have to file a formal request that could take weeks. I hung up, defeated once again. The next day, the debt collection agency called. A woman named Tara wanted to discuss payment options. I told her I wasn't paying a single cent for my molester's education. Tara's voice was flat and unwavering. She said the personal history between me and the deceased was irrelevant to the financial obligation. At that point, I just lost it, screaming into the phone about how messed up the whole system was. Tara just waited patiently until I was done, then calmly repeated that I needed to make payment arrangements. I hung up on her too. I tried a nonprofit legal aid group in my city, hoping for free help. They put me on a waiting list, saying they were swamped. The receptionist sounded sympathetic, at least. I went back to work the next day, feeling like a zombie. My boss, Kendra, noticed something was off and pulled me aside. I ended up telling her everything. She looked horrified and offered to connect me with her brother-in-law, who worked at a law firm specializing in estate issues. I thanked her, feeling the first tiny glimmer of hope in days. Kendra's brother-in-law, Thomas, agreed to meet with me after work. He had a fancy downtown office with leather chairs and diplomas covering the walls. He listened carefully to my story, taking notes. When I was done, he leaned back and sighed. He confirmed that while it was unusual, some states do allow certain debts to transfer. He said student loans were particularly nasty because they typically can't be discharged in bankruptcy. Thomas said he'd look into it, but warned me it would be an uphill battle. I left his office feeling slightly better, but still terrified. A few days later, a letter arrived, summoning me to a small claims hearing about the debt. They were already suing me. I called Thomas immediately, and he agreed to go with me. The courthouse was cold and intimidating. The collection company sent some slick lawyer in an expensive suit. The judge barely glanced at me as the hearing started. The company's lawyer presented all the documents showing Andrew's loans and my status as next of kin. When it was my turn, I tried to explain that Andrew had sexually abused me as a child, that I hadn't seen him in over 20 years, that I wanted nothing to do with him or his debts. The judge looked uncomfortable, but said that, unfortunately, the law was clear. Thomas argued that forcing me to pay was a form of re-victimization, but the judge said his hands were tied by the statutes. He scheduled another hearing in 2 weeks to set up a payment schedule. I walked out of that courthouse feeling like I'd been physically punched. Thomas patted my shoulder and promised we'd find a way to fight this. I wasn't so sure. I went home and looked at my finances, about $7,000 in savings, a car worth maybe $12,000, and a rented apartment. There was no way I could pay off $250,000. I'd either have to declare bankruptcy, which might not even work, or go to prison. Neither option felt fair. I started having panic attacks, waking up in the middle of the night, gasping for breath. I couldn't focus at work. Kendra was understanding, but I could tell my performance was slipping. My coworkers started treating me differently. I decided to try one last angle and contacted my old therapist, Dr. Martinez. I hadn't seen her in years, but she remembered me. I explained what was happening, and she was outraged. She offered to write a letter to the court explaining the psychological impact this debt would have on me as a survivor. I thanked her, though I wasn't sure it would help. The day before the second hearing, Thomas called with some news. He'd been researching Andrew's case and found something interesting. As part of his sentencing, Andrew had been ordered to pay restitution to my parents for their legal fees and my therapy costs. According to the records, he never paid a single penny. Thomas said this might be our way out. If Andrew died owing a debt to my parents, and I was their heir, then technically, Andrew's estate owed me money first. Any remaining assets would have to go toward that restitution before any other debts. Since my parents had passed, I would be the one entitled to that money. I felt a surge of hope for the first time in weeks. The second hearing was even more tense. The collection company's lawyer looked smug. Thomas presented our new argument about the restitution order, providing copies of the court documents. The company's lawyer objected, saying restitution orders expired upon death. The judge called for a short recess. Those 15 minutes felt like an eternity. When he returned, he looked thoughtful. He said that while the restitution order was valid, he needed more time to determine if it took precedence over the student loan debt. He scheduled another hearing for the following month. I left the courthouse feeling slightly better, but still on edge. The waiting was almost worse than a final decision. The debt collection company didn't wait for the next hearing. They started calling daily, each time with a different person. They sent letters threatening to garnish my wages and seize my property. One particularly aggressive collector named Vincent showed up at my workplace, causing a scene in the lobby that left me utterly mortified. Kendra threatened to call security, and he finally left. Thomas filed a harassment complaint, but the agency just denied any wrongdoing. The stress was taking a physical toll. I lost weight, couldn't sleep, and had constant headaches. My friend Marcus convinced me to stay with him for a few days to get away from my apartment. The day of the final hearing arrived. Thomas had prepared an extensive brief with legal precedents. The collection agency's lawyer had his own stack of cases. The judge listened to both sides, asking detailed questions. I sat there feeling like my entire future was hanging in the balance. Finally, after what seemed like forever, the judge cleared his throat and delivered his ruling. He determined that the restitution order did, in fact, take precedence. Since Andrew had died with no assets, there was nothing left to pay the student loans after the restitution was accounted for. The company couldn't force me to pay because, legally, his estate owed me money first. The judge dismissed the case. I sat there in total shock as Thomas patted me on the back. The collection agency's lawyer looked furious. I walked out of that courthouse feeling like I could finally breathe again. Thomas warned me they might appeal, but he thought our case was solid. I thanked him for everything, promising to pay his legal fees, though it would take a while. He told me not to worry, that getting justice was payment enough. I went back to Marcus's place and just collapsed on his couch, drained but relieved. The collection agency did appeal, but the higher court upheld the ruling. After 6 months of hell, I was finally free. The whole experience left me shaken. I couldn't believe how close I had come to having my life destroyed all over again by the same man. I decided to channel my anger into something productive. I started volunteering at a local advocacy center for abuse survivors, sharing my story. I also began working with a nonprofit pushing for changes to debt inheritance laws. My case wasn't unique. I moved to a new apartment, changed my phone number, and tried to put it all behind me. I still had nightmares, but they were less frequent. I felt stronger for having fought a system designed to crush people like me. A year later, I got a letter from Westfield University. They'd heard about my case from the media coverage and were implementing new policies to prevent similar situations. They also offered me a full scholarship if I ever wanted to pursue a degree. I appreciated it, but decided college wasn't for me. I was doing okay at my job, and my volunteer work gave me a sense of purpose. Sometimes I think about Andrew and wonder if he knew what he was doing when he named me his next of kin. Part of me thinks it was his final act of abuse, reaching from beyond the grave. But I survived it, just like I survived everything else. And I made sure he couldn't hurt anyone else the same way. The debt collection agency eventually went out of business after multiple lawsuits. I felt a sense of satisfaction knowing they couldn't prey on vulnerable people anymore. Thomas helped me set up a trust to protect any future assets. He became a good friend. My story ended up in a documentary about predatory debt collection, which helped raise awareness. Several states changed their laws as a result. I still think about how close I came to losing everything. It makes me angry, but it also motivates me to keep fighting. No one should have to pay for the crimes of their abuser. That old debt collector thought he could intimidate me, but he underestimated how much fight I had left. Andrew took enough from me as a child. I wasn't going to let him take my future, too. These days, I focus on the positive. I have good friends, meaningful work, and my health. The nightmares are rare now, and when they come, I remind myself that I'm safe, that I won. People ask if I've forgiven Andrew. I tell them forgiveness isn't what matters. Justice does. And finally, after all these years, I got a small measure of it. Not just for me, but for that scared 7-year-old boy who wasn't believed. I hope he'd be proud of the man I've become. Sometimes the system works, even if you have to force it to. And sometimes the good guys win. That victory, however, lasted exactly 3 days, 7 hours, and 24 minutes. I was sitting at my kitchen table when the first email came through, a simple notification from the court system. I opened it without a second thought, my coffee mug halfway to my lips. The appeal had been filed. Andrew's family had deep pockets, and they weren't giving up. I set the mug down before I could drop it, my hand starting to shake. The triumph I'd felt began to crack. I called my lawyer right away. She promised to review the paperwork, but told me appeals were standard, nothing to worry about. But I did worry. I worried every second. I couldn't sleep that night or the next. The nightmares came back with a vengeance. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, hearing his voice. 3 weeks later, we got the hearing date. 6 months away. 6 months of waiting, of looking over my shoulder. I tried to keep living my life. I went to work, came home, paid my bills, but the weight of it all was suffocating. My friends noticed I was withdrawing again. They invited me out more. I rarely accepted. The local paper ran a follow-up story. A reporter called for a comment. I let it go to voicemail. Then the letters started. Some offered support, others called me a liar. The worst came from Andrew's family, detailing what they planned to do after they won. I kept them all in a folder. Evidence, my lawyer called it. Harassment, I called it. I installed a security camera on my porch, then another on my back door, then one in my driveway. I changed my number twice. I deleted my social media. The isolation felt both terrible and necessary. Fall turned to winter. The days got shorter, the shadows longer. I adopted a dog from the local shelter, a big mutt with gentle eyes and a loud bark. I named him Justice. It felt a little on the nose, but it made me smile. He slept at the foot of my bed, and his presence helped with the nightmares. Christmas came and went. I spent it alone with Justice and a frozen pizza. New Year's, too. I told myself I prefer it that way, but the lie was wearing thin. February brought ice storms and a notice from the court. Andrew's lawyer had filed for a dismissal based on new evidence. My stomach plummeted. I called my lawyer in a panic. She hadn't seen it yet. She called back 3 hours later. The new evidence was a supposed witness, someone claiming they saw me somewhere else when the incident happened. 20 years later, suddenly they remembered. My lawyer wasn't worried. The judge would see through it. I wasn't so sure. The system had failed me before. I started preparing for the worst, putting money aside, researching places to move, updating my passport, just in case. The winter dragged on. Justice and I took long walks in the snow. I started seeing my therapist twice a week. She suggested meditation. I tried, but my mind wouldn't quiet down. March brought more paperwork, motions, counter-motions, legal jargon that made my head spin. The stress was affecting my job. I was making mistakes. My boss was understanding, but his patience had limits. I needed this job. The legal bills were mounting. I forced myself to compartmentalize. Work during work hours, panic after 5 p.m. It helped a little. April brought rain and the dismissal of Andrew's motion. The judge saw through the fake witness. One small victory. I celebrated with takeout and ice cream. Justice got his own dog-safe ice cream cup. For one evening, things felt almost normal. Then May arrived, 1 month until the appeal hearing. I started rehearsing my testimony constantly, in the shower, in the car while walking Justice. The pressure was building. I developed an eye twitch, my appetite vanished. 2 weeks before the hearing, I got a call. Andrew wanted to meet, no lawyers. I laughed until I realized the caller was serious. I hung up. He called back. I blocked the number. That night, a car drove by my house slowly twice. I called the police. They took a report, but did nothing. The next day, I bought a baseball bat and kept it by my bed. Justice growled at every sound. I started sleeping on the couch for a better view of the doors. 1 week out, my lawyer called with news. The prosecutor had found 3 more victims, all with similar stories. They were willing to testify. For the first time in months, I felt something like hope. Maybe the system wouldn't fail this time. The day of the hearing arrived. I wore my best suit. Reporters waited outside. Security was tight. The courtroom seemed smaller. Andrew sat across the aisle. He had aged. Our eyes met briefly. I didn't look away first. The new victims testified one by one. Their stories aligned with mine. Andrew's lawyer tried to poke holes in their testimony, but he failed. When it was my turn, I spoke clearly. I told the simple truth. It was enough. The hearing lasted 3 days. On the 3rd day, the judge denied the appeal. Andrew's face went from red to white. His lawyer whispered urgently in his ear. I sat perfectly still, afraid to believe it was really over. The judge added a final ruling. Andrew would be listed on the sex offender registry, something that should have happened 20 years ago. Outside, reporters shouted questions. I gave no comment. I drove home in a daze. Justice greeted me at the door. I knelt and buried my face in his fur, and the tears finally came. Relief. The weight wasn't gone, but it was lighter. Days passed, then weeks. No appeal of the appeal. My lawyer said that avenue was closed. The case was truly over. I started sleeping in my bed again. I deleted the security camera footage without watching it. I cooked real meals. Small steps toward normal. Summer arrived. I took a week off. Justice and I drove to the beach. We walked the shore every morning. I felt my shoulders gradually unclench. One evening, watching the sunset, I felt at peace for the first time in years. When we got home, there was a letter waiting, a thank you note from one of the other victims. He wrote that my coming forward gave him courage. He'd been silent for decades. Now he was free too. I pinned his letter to my fridge, a reminder that some good had come from all of this. Months passed. The nightmares became rare. I started accepting social invitations again. Justice adjusted. Fall brought a call from a victims advocacy group. They wanted me to speak at a fundraiser. My first instinct was to say no, but the cause was important. I agreed. I spent weeks preparing. The night of the fundraiser, I waited backstage, fighting the urge to run. Then they called my name. I walked to the podium, took a deep breath, and told my story. Not just the abuse, not just the trial, but everything after. When I finished, the room was silent. Then someone started clapping, and then everyone was on their feet. A standing ovation. I hadn't done it for applause, but the recognition felt like a balm on old wounds. After, people lined up to talk, to share their own stories, to thank me. It was exhausting and exhilarating. Winter arrived. This year, I put up a small tree. I bought Justice a ridiculous reindeer costume. I sent Christmas cards for the first time in years. I accepted an invitation to a New Year's party. Life was moving forward. There were still bad days, still triggers, but they became less frequent. I developed better coping mechanisms. One cold January morning, I got another call. A detective from another state. They had found my name while investigating a similar case. Same perpetrator, different victim. They needed my testimony. Fear and anger resurfaced, but something new emerged alongside them. Determination. I agreed to help. The investigation moved slowly. Spring came again. The case in the other state moved toward trial. The prosecutor was confident. I prepared myself for another courtroom, another cross-examination. I knew I could do it now. I'd done it before. Summer brought the trial. I drove across state lines with Justice. I took the stand and told my story again. Andrew's lawyer tried the same tired tactics. They fell flat. The evidence was stronger this time. The trial lasted 2 weeks. I stayed for all of it to support the new victim. She was younger than me, braver too, I thought. The jury deliberated for less than a day. Guilty on all counts. The sentence was harder this time. 20 years, no possibility of early release. I watched them lead him away. His eyes found mine. I saw no remorse, only anger. I felt nothing in return. Not satisfaction, not joy, just an emptiness where the fear used to live. The drive home seemed shorter. I found comfort in the mundane. Back home, life settled into a new rhythm. The nightmares came rarely, and they'd lost their power. Progress, my therapist called it. Freedom, I called it. Fall brought another letter. The advocacy group wanted me to join their board. I surprised myself by accepting immediately. The work would be challenging, but it would mean purpose, a way to transform suffering into action. Winter arrived. I found myself laughing more easily. The board meetings began in January. I met others with similar stories. We connected instantly. We drafted proposals, met with legislators, spoke at events. Slowly, we began to see change. Spring came. I began mentoring younger survivors, showing them the path I'd walked. Watching them grow, stronger healed something in me. Summer arrived. Justice was now 7 years old, slower on our walks. The anniversary of the first trial passed without me even noticing. 3 years of rebuilding, of reclaiming who I was beyond what happened. I wasn't just a victim or a survivor anymore. I was something more. Fall brought unexpected news. Andrew had died in prison. A heart attack. I sat with the information for a long time. I felt no happiness, no satisfaction, no grief. Perhaps it was simply closure. The final period at the end of a very long sentence. I told my therapist it felt like putting down a heavy backpack I'd carried for decades. The weight was gone, though the memory of it remained. Winter came again. This year, Christmas involved family. My sister hosted. My nephew played holiday songs on his trumpet, badly but with enthusiasm. Being together was the real present. I wrote in my journal about the year's progress, about family rebuilt, about strength found in vulnerability. I slept peacefully that night. January brought seed catalogs. My nephew circled the weird vegetables, purple carrots, striped tomatoes. We plotted garden expansion together. February's thaw revealed muddy earth. I started seedlings indoors, tiny pots lining the windowsills, each one a promise. March's winds blew winter away. My sister joined me one weekend to work in the garden. Healing comes in unexpected forms. The anniversary of the attack arrived quietly. I lit a candle for the boy I was and thanked him for surviving. My nephew called that evening, as if he knew. April brought his 15th birthday. I baked a ridiculous cake. His smile was worth every second of the journey. The garden called me back outside daily. May delivered sunshine and growth. My confidence expanded. I accepted an invitation to speak at a survivors group. Truth carries its own power. June, my nephew finished freshman year with honors. I brought fresh salsa from the garden to his celebration. I belonged there. July's heat tested us all. I adapted, listened to what the plants needed. My sister announced she was dating someone new. Her happiness mattered. August harvests overwhelmed my kitchen. I taught my nephew to make pasta sauce, how work becomes nourishment. We talked about the future, his dreams, my hopes for maybe dating someday. Normal things, once impossible to imagine. September cooled the air. I cleared spent plants, saved seeds. Continuity matters. The 3-year mark approached, another parole hearing. I prepared with confidence, not fear. October painted the leaves. I raked them into the garden beds as mulch. Everything serves a purpose eventually. The hearing notification arrived. I opened it without trembling. November, I testified. The board agreed. 5 more years, minimum. The relief was less desperate, more measured. I celebrated with family. December wrapped the year in reflection. Snow dusted the dormant garden. I thought about cycles and seasons, about necessary rest before growth. I went inside to write another letter, this one to my nephew, now almost a man. I told him everything I'd learned about strength and breaking, about gardens and second chances, about standing in the sunshine after a long darkness. I sealed the envelope with peaceful certainty. Spring would come again. It always does. With warmth and new growth, with birds returning home, with sunshine without shadows, with a promise kept, year after year.